Before we start the show, we've all heard that the ABC has canned its Q&A show, which is called Q&A, but we haven't canned ours. We are very keen for you out there in listener land to send us in some questions. We will go through them and we will pick some that we think we can answer, and we will do exactly that on a podcast of our choosing in the near future. So if you'd like to write in, there will be an email address in the description of this episode. It turns out that Troy Pannel lasts another season or two after that, and at some point either he decided to retire from the top level of the game or he was moved on, one or the other. The other interest that he had apart from women other than his wife was racing and racehorses. They basically said that he had favoured the Bulldogs, and that had the free kick count been reversed, that they might well have won the game. I'm Andrew Rule. This is Life and Crimes. As we go to air with this story, it's already been out there for quite a while that a former AFL umpire, quite a distinguished and experienced umpire called Troy Pannel, had gone missing. Troy Pannel was a Western suburban umpire as a youngster, and in 2005, against the advice of those people who knew him best out in the western suburbs, at the old Footscray District League as it was, against their advice, the AFL recruited him as an AFL umpire, and he went on to umpire for 13 years until 2018. And in that time, he was regarded, I think, in many ways a pretty good umpire, pretty quick and experienced, seasoned, all that good stuff. But he did have a few falls from grace, and there's one spectacular one, which is perhaps interesting in the context of what happened later. In 2016, Troy Pannel umpired a game at Docklands between the team that he actually supports, that would be the Western Bulldogs, and the Adelaide Crows, who come from another state and have very little to do with Melbourne and don't have a lot of followers in Melbourne. But they do have a lot of followers in Adelaide, where they're from. And in this game, of course, we have, two umpires. In this game, Troy Pannel awarded 17 free kicks to the Western Bulldogs and 1 to the Adelaide Crows. Now, this was a very tight game, and in fact, at one point towards the full-time siren, just minutes out, the Bulldogs, I think, were only 2 points ahead. Adelaide were within 1 kick of winning the game. Then along came a magic free for the Bulldogs, and bang, bang, couple of quick goals, and ultimately the Bulldogs won by 15 points. Now, that win, which was back in May of 2016, but that win was a crucial one for the Bulldogs because it pushed them up the table towards the top, which meant that they would get a run at the finals and then get into the finals. And indeed, as any football follower knows, they came home with a wet sail and they won an historic premiership flag. The first one, I think, since 1954. So it was basically the first flag in a lifetime, and only the second Footscray flag, as we used to say, Footscray or Bulldogs flag in history in our AFL, or formerly VFL. Now, this greatly incensed the Crows supporters as the season wore on, and the Crows were obviously not going to get to the grand final. Crows supporters formed a deep and abiding hatred of Troy Pannel and blamed him for their problems. They basically said that he had favoured the Bulldogs, and that had the free kick count been reversed, that they might well have won the game and gone on to greater things, and meanwhile the Bulldogs would not have. Now, that is a supposition that's there to be made, and they may well be right. But to some extent, most people would think of that as just partisan barracking by highly partisan supporters in Adelaide against highly partisan supporters of the Bulldogs here in Western Melbourne. Let's jump forward a couple of years. It turns out that Troy Pannel lasts another season or two after that exhibition of umpiring. I think there was widespread criticism, and perhaps some of that criticism permeated the AFL, and at some point either he decided to retire from the top level of the game or he was moved on, one or the other. And he, I think, umpired at a lesser level, and he became, I think, a coach of other umpires, junior league umpires or whatever, that sort of stuff. He lived in the outer west. I think he'd grown up around Werribee. He bought a nice new house on a big block, a big new house on a big new block with a swimming pool at Gisborne. 60 days after that big game, the Docklands game, interestingly, that was on the 7th of May, and 60 days later on the 7th of July, which might be a total coincidence and probably is, he bought a big new house at Gisborne for just north of $800,000, which was a fair amount at the time in 2016. It's now 8 years ago. That house these days is probably in the low 1 point somethings, 1.2, 1.3, quite a bit. That house is not out of the way. I guess a guy who was just turning 40, mid-career, he's got a pretty reasonable job at a place called Sea Roads Shipping, I think it's called. They're based in Port Melbourne, and they run container traffic, a lot of container traffic, across Bass Strait and I think across the Tasman to New Zealand. Thousands of containers a year in goods being shipped back and forth. Troy Pannel's day job was as a sort of a managerial role inside that Sea Road shipping business. That job, it wasn't terribly highly paid, but it was quite responsible. He'd been there some years and he was trusted with, organising payments around the office, and he was authorised to pay bills of up to $5,000, etc., etc. And it turns out that he might have seen this as an opportunity because at some point Troy Pannel became the sole director and proprietor of a small and obscure company which had a name something like Containers Surveying and Maintenance Proprietary Limited or similar, a name like that. And it was a name that suggested that what that company did was to maintain shipping containers, that if you had containers that had a problem or loose rivets or hinges that were broken or whatever it might be, that this company could take your container on the back of a truck and, weld it up or fix things and make sure it was fit for purpose. Good idea. The only problem with it was that this company was apparently a false front. It was a bogus company. It was a company, but it didn't actually have a workshop and it didn't actually allegedly do any work. It didn't take containers anywhere and it didn't work on them wherever they were. No work was being done. The only transaction to do with that little company between Sea Roads Shipping, Troy Pannel's employer, and this little company he set up, the only transaction was that every month or so he would invoice Sea Road Shipping for the maintenance of X number of containers. And the reality of this is that over a 10-year period, can you believe this? A 10-year period, he had charged the company he worked for around $800 a throw, $800 a time for each container that they were using. Over 10 years, that added up to something like 100,000 containers. In a year, they'd use, 10,000 containers or whatever, and over 10 years, it's 100,000. And the result of that, if you multiply it by 800, is $8.7 million that this company that he had set up allegedly stripped $8.7 million out of his employer's cash accounts. Clearly, it was quite a successful business, Sea Roads Shipping, because no one actually noticed that this might be a problem. No one was actually having a close look at the containers to see what was being done or not being done to them. And it came to light only because of an alert accountant who said, there's a problem here with GST and BAS, this company, container surveying, whatever it's called. they're not paying BAS. Now, we better ask Troy here, who handles all that transactions with the containers maintenance, what's going on there? And they asked him, and he ducked the question, and it wasn't long before they worked out that the money had been paid out into basically a void. And indeed, when you looked up this company, its sole director was one Troy Pannel, their own shipping manager or whatever his title was. Now, his title, sounded good, but he was on a salary of only about $110,000 for most of that time. Not a big salary, but probably okay, given it probably wasn't a lot of hard work, and clearly he wasn't being supervised very strictly. He could pretty well do what he liked, and indeed he did do what he liked. So the balloon went up last year in 2024, and ultimately he was summoned to court. They started a civil action against him and against his company, I suppose, and it was all heading in that direction. He obviously could no longer work for them, and he was going to turn up to court, and eventually the system would have extracted large amounts of money from him and his assets in order to pay back his employer, part at least of what he'd allegedly stripped from them. Now, what were his assets? Now, this is interesting. Troy Pannel had bought the house at Gisborne, yes, that was 2016. Troy Pannel and his then wife, who claims no knowledge of any of these things, and I have no reason to disbelieve her. I'm told by a lawyer that I trust that she has been sort of broadsided by this, that she's been lied to consistently, and we'll come to that. And he has apparently betrayed those closest to him quite a bit. He and his then wife, they had premises in Kyneton called Duck Duck Goose, the larder, I think it was called. It was a sort of a food shop. I think it did pizzas and it did food, and it might have done giftware and stuff as well. It was sort of quite a big, stylish premises in the main street of Kyneton. It was the sort of place that people driving through, tourist traffic, that sort of thing, they'd pull up, maybe buy something from Memento and buy some food or whatever, coffee. And another one down in Seddon. Now that, of course, is the upmarket piece of Footscray, Seddon, and he had one there with quite a fashionable name. I think it was called something Galaxia. It was a small and fashionable cafe of the sort that people refer to as Instagrammable. It would produce beautifully served dishes of meals that people would take photographs of before they consumed them, as some people do. So Troy Pannel, until the manure hit the fan, seemed to be going okay. He was involved in the businesses. He had the house at Gisborne where he and his then wife lived with their children, I think 2 children. But Troy had a few worries. He had a few other responsibilities. One of them was he forgot where he actually lived, and he formed an attachment for a woman other than his wife, and she was ensconced in a property in Ascot Vale. And he had a long-term relationship with her while still living at home with his wife, and he managed to father a baby girl with that woman, and that led to some disharmony in his domestic arrangements, as it might. In fact, his wife, the wife he's married to, called him a liar and a cheat, which a lot of people would probably agree with. And the other interest that he had apart from women other than his wife was racing and racehorses. And Troy Pannel, he used to go to New Zealand, I think regularly because of his work. I think perhaps sea road shipping had a bit to do with shipping across the Tasman to New Zealand, and he used to go there fairly regularly. And at some point he decided that he would get more involved in racing. He'd clearly always been a bit keen on it. And he started to buy the odd horse in New Zealand. But this is where the story gets interesting. You'd expect Troy Pannel, he's suspect number one for draining $8.7 million out of a company. You'd expect probably, if you were guessing, you'd think that he was somebody who would buy expensive racehorses and bet like the Watsons, just bet in, $5,000 lots, $10,000 lots, and bet like hell. But he didn't. He bought cheap horses in New Zealand. The best one he bought, the best racehorse that he bought, actually cost $10,000 as a yearling, which is less than the cost of production. It's a bargain. It's sort of hack price. That's what people pay for a good kid's pony, really. And he bought this filly for $10,000 in 2018. He did a deal with a husband and wife training team over there. That is Vaughan and Trudy Keegan, who are sort of boutique trainers. They're people who train 20 or 30 horses, sort of small stable. And he said, can you get this one broken in and train it for me, whatever. And they did. And then he bought another horse and another horse. And I think eventually, around that time, 2018-19, the beginning of COVID, he had up to 9 horses over there. Now, even in New Zealand where prices are lower, and I think racehorses can be trained a bit cheaper in New Zealand, he was running up bills of around $10,000 a month. Now, that is quite a bit for the average person. But if you are, as it is alleged, stripping out somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million a year from an embezzlement scheme, and this is the allegation about Troy Pannel, he would have plenty of money to pay $10,000 a month in training fees, because that would work out at about $120,000 a year, and yet it is alleged that he was getting anything up to $800,000 a year out of his alleged scheme. And so really, even though it's a big expense, $10,000 a month for the average working wage person, in the context of this, it's not. The other thing is this: you would expect him to be a big punter. You'd expect him to be a degenerate punter. But again, this is a bit surprising. Now, I set out on this story to find out who Troy Pannel really was. And I thought, no worries, he will be another one of these embezzlers, like the classic bank manager, the classic bank teller, these people that can get their hands on money. They start gambling, they have a loss, they think they can borrow some out of the till, go to the races, put it on, the favourite, win it, ball back, go back, restore it to the till, go to the casino, put it on black or red, etc. It's the slippery slope, and it happens a lot, and it has always happened, and there are always gambling addicts who will end up embezzling cash to cover their losses. And they become more and more desperate because, they're $2 million in the hole. They've got to try and bet their way out. There's no other way, and they become increasingly desperate. I thought this would be that case, but I put out some feelers with a couple of sources in the corporate gaming and betting industry, as they call it. And one of those sources knows a lot of people across certain corporate bookmakers, and the other one knows other people in other corporate bookmakers. So we're looking here at, Ladbrokes Sportsbet, the TAB, Tabcorp, Bet365, BetR, all the usual suspects. And the message I got back from both those contacts was, we've never heard of this guy. And if he's betting, we doubt he's betting big, and clearly if he's betting using somebody else's accounts, not his own, certainly not his own name. He doesn't seem to exist. And I thought, well, that's not that surprising. As a former AFL umpire, he will have been flagged as a person who shouldn't bet on sporting contests or whatever. Okay, so I then talk to live bookies, the old-fashioned bookies who go to the races and put up the odds on a board and say, give it a name, punters, and all that stuff. And the two I spoke to are two of the most well-known, experienced and biggest bookies left in this state. There aren't that many of them left, but these two guys are right up there. And they are very wise people. They have seen a lot of punters come and go. And it's fair to say that if there was someone betting in telephone numbers, these guys would know about it. If the guy was not betting through them, they would have heard who he was betting through. Same result. Neither of them had heard anything about this Troy Pannel, or indeed about anybody that sort of fits the profile. Bookies call these sort of guys a gold brick. A gold brick is someone with access to a lot of money who feels an urge to bet with it. Bookies love them because ultimately they will lose, and bookies will benefit from those losses. They had never heard of anyone matching that description. No gold brick, regardless of the name. They just hadn't heard of one. My 4 contacts across the entire betting gaming industry in Victoria are telling me that this bloke isn't an active large punter. Now, the 2 lots of trainers that have trained for him, that is the husband and wife team in New Zealand, the Keegans, and quite a respected small trainer here at Kyneton called Charles Casser. Nice guy. Looks like Frank Zappa, the musician. And in fact, Charles Casser, before he was a horse trainer, at one point, he used to sing and play guitar in rock and roll bands. So there you go. A bit of Frank Zappa about him. Charles is a horseman first, racehorse trainer second. He trains a few horses and goes okay at Kyneton, lives a nice life with the family on the farm and trains away. He told me, he had a conversation with me, he said he met Troy Pannel at the races at Geelong. They used to both be around Geelong at one time. And he said it was one of those casual relationships you fall into at the races. You see somebody semi-regularly and you get to nod to them and say, hello, mate, hello, mate. And he said, I only knew him as mate for quite a while before I knew what his name was. I had no idea what he did. I didn't know he's an umpire. I'd just see him at the races occasionally. And at some point, he's approached me and said, I've got a horse. It's a barrier rogue or a float rogue. It won't load in a float. And I need somebody who's a good horseman to try and train it, handle it, educate it. And I think the story was that Casser undertook to try and re-educate the horse or whatever. It doesn't matter. But that's how he started off training the odd horse for Troy Pannel. What's his summary of Troy Pannel? Well, his summary of him is nice enough bloke. Didn't see that much of him. He said he didn't visit the stables, all the time. He didn't hang around all the time. Now and again he'd visit the stables. But he said he didn't give the vibe of the wealthy owner, the owner with cash to burn. He didn't give the vibe of the guy that's pulling $800,000 a year out of a business and spending it on racing or on anything else. He said his cars were sort of working class cars. He said at one point he had a fairly second-hand Subaru, and another time he had a fairly second-hand RAV4. That's the small Toyota SUV, a reasonably humble vehicle. He said that was the sort of vehicle he was driving. I was aware that he had the businesses in Kyneton, but nothing about him shouted spare money or money to burn. And he said, I doubt he ever had a really big bet. He said a lot of owners talk as if they bet bigger than they do. He said quite a lot, talking thousands, or talk about having 500 each way on a horse or whatever. And he said the reality usually is it's half that. If they say they're having 500 each way, it's probably 200 each way. And he said, I can only remember one time where I think he backed one heavily enough to push it down from $9, a $9 quote, that is 8 to 1 in the old, into $3.50. And that was at Ararat. Now, Ararat races, God bless it, is a reasonably small meeting, reasonably small event where the betting pools are small. And if someone had a solid bet, a $1,000 bet, it may well push a horse into much shorter odds, at least temporarily. And he said that would be the only time I can think of when Troy Pannel had a decent bet. And he said he never seemed to put enough on to want to sling a jockey for winning. He said if we won a race, he said I'd drink bourbon. He never bought me a bottle of bourbon, which you'd expect an owner to do occasionally if you win a race for them, buy a present. just sort of the manners. Never did any of that. He said he wasn't a big noter. He didn't spend up. I didn't see any sign of spare cash. Now, back in New Zealand, we've got horses being trained in 2 countries. Back in New Zealand, we had the filly that he paid $10,000 for. In New Zealand, she proved to be a very handy animal. And the trainers over there, the Keegans, told Troy Pannel, this is around 2019, I think, in there. They said this filly's got ability, and they waited for her to grow out. She's a great big thing, big and tall and long. They had to wait for her to sort of keep growing. And eventually, as a 3-year-old, they gave her her first start. Now, she started in what we would call sort of a semi-city start. It was at Awapuni, which is the Palmerston North racetrack. It's a pretty serious racetrack on the North Island. And maybe like Geelong here or something like that, or maybe Cranbourne, pretty serious track. And she won easily. She won by 5 lengths. Interestingly, she paid $8.50. Starting price was $8.50, which would suggest that no one had a fortune on it. Clearly no one had, 20 grand on it. But they think if Troy Pannel is telling the truth, which we're not sure, they think Troy Pannel hooked that filly up in multi-bets, so with her to win, with another one to run a placing, with another one to do something else. They put together these multi-bets, and they said that he told them that he'd invested $6,500 and he ended up winning more than 80 that day. And maybe he had some other bets as well and claimed that ultimately that day he'd won more than 100. But anyway, they saw no actual proof of it, but he did on that occasion give them a gift. He gave them a sling, as it's known in the trade. And I suspect that sling was much smaller than the bills that he didn't pay subsequently, because that filly, he brought her across to Australia. He took her up to his other trainer, Charles Casser at Kyneton. And as soon as she started working at Kyneton, the first thing that the local trainers and jockeys and work riders noticed was that the filly was a roarer. She had a throat obstruction, is the way to put it, which meant that as she galloped with any sort of speed and breathed heavily, she had a very loud, raspy breath, which is an indicator of a throat problem. And it's something that, when it's that serious, it has to be remedied. If it can be remedied at all, it has to be remedied with quite serious surgery, throat surgery. And indeed, what happened was they operated on that filly, and she had a long spell, I think 9 months, and they brought her back in. The best she could do here in Australia, in Melbourne, was to run third. She ran third. Rest of the time, she ran basically mostly last. So she went completely wrong. So Troy Pannel's big throw at the stumps, the $10,000 filly that won 3 good races in New Zealand and won him some money, when he gets here, she goes wrong, as happens with horses. And eventually, when his problems started, he sold her for $50,000 as a broodmare. The people that bought her sold her for $170,000 as a broodmare, which was an interesting turnaround. And in the meantime, someone sold a foal out of her for $150,000. Now, that foal was not sold by Troy Pannel, not officially anyway. It was sold in the name of a particular stud. And studs sometimes do that on behalf of clients. They prepare yearlings for sales. And, Joe Smith might have a yearling to sell, so he takes it to Shady Trees Stud, and Shady Trees Stud say, we'll look after your yearling for $55 a day, and we'll lead it around and groom it and rug it and feed it and make it beautiful and shiny. And providing you pay the bills, we'll organise all that and sell it for you at the sales. And after we take out our cut, you'll get the balance. Now, it might be that yearling that was sold for $150,000 to the top trainer, Kieran Ma, it's quite possible that, a large percentage of that money went to Troy Pannel. I don't know. And in a sense, it probably doesn't matter. What matters is that when the horse manure hit the fan late last year, Troy Pannel was on notice that he was in diabolical trouble. First of all, he was going to be sued to return the money that was missing. And clearly that would mean that any assets that he owned would be liable, shops, houses, whatever, horses, whatever it might be. He was due to front at the Supreme Court in Melbourne on the 9th of May this year. That's only a few weeks ago. He didn't front. And about 35 minutes after he was due in court, so this is, 10:35 or whatever, the lawyers for the other side get an email from him saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't make it to court today. I've hit a kangaroo in my car and I have no functioning indicator and my windscreen is cracked and I'm sitting by the side of the road." He didn't say where, I don't think. "I'm sitting by the side of the road waiting for roadside assist or a tow truck or whatever." And that more or less was the last that anybody had heard or seen of Troy Pannel. Subsequently, a warrant was issued for his arrest, and by mid-May he had vanished into smoke. He'd hit the toe, as they say, and had gone, everyone thinks, interstate or somewhere, and he wasn't really heard of apart from one email suggesting that he was in Queensland, which is possibly untrue that he was there. He may well have been closer to home. None of us knew where he was. I suspect no one knew where he was, but it would appear that the authorities, despite the arrest warrant, were happy to leave him out there somewhere, providing he got a chance to turn up to court for his latest hearing on the 6th of June. He didn't front, and in fact on that day he was spotted by a police car in central Victoria, not that far from Daylesford, and apparently at some point he's crashed his car, a lone vehicle crash, as if he's run off the road and hit a tree or whatever it was. Now, he was apparently injured badly enough, or it appeared that he was injured badly enough, that he was flown to the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne to be treated. It appeared that he was seriously injured and there was a lot of sympathy for his situation, but it would appear that he wasn't terribly seriously injured and that at some point in the near future he will front court to face the original proceedings and also at some point to face charges. And that is where that story sits. So we're looking at a man that is an umpire who fancied a life of wine, women and racehorses. Not necessarily in that order. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is Jonty Burton. For my columns, features and more, go to heraldsun.com.au/Andrew Rule, one word. For advertising inquiries, go to newspodcastssold@news.com.au. That is all one word, newspodcastssold. And if you want further information about this episode, links are in the description.